They called him Thunder, and he lived up to every syllable of his name. Even before the gates opened that day, word had already swept through the stands of the Silver Ridge Equestrian Showcase. Spectators clutched the railings, leaning forward with a mixture of awe and unease, whispering about the stallion who refused to be broken. He wasn't just a horse, he was a legend in motion. Midnight black, with a mane that whipped like lightning through the wind and eyes that burned like wildfire, Thunder didn't move. He prowled, radiating defiance with every ripple of muscle beneath his coat. And today, under the bright glare of the sun and the scrutiny of hundreds, everyone would finally see why no man had been able to tame him. For weeks, trainers had tried everything. Ropes had snapped. Whips had been ignored. One handler ended up in the hospital with a fractured collarbone after Thunder launched himself skyward, kicking with such force it echoed like thunderclaps across the empty hills. They even attempted sedatives once, just enough to calm him. It barely made a dent. The moment the drugs wore off, Thunder returned with fury, more furious than before, rearing and shrieking as though he were cursing the very idea of control. One trainer, after being thrown to the ground for the third time, simply stood up, wiped the blood from his brow and muttered, "He's got the devil's fire in him." And that was the last time he dared enter Thunder's corral. Even behind the reinforced fencing of the arena, Thunder didn't rest. He paced like a caged storm, his eyes always scanning, always challenging. When the announcer's voice crackled over the loudspeakers that morning, introducing him as the untamable fury from the Nevada plains, the crowd cheered. But it wasn't the cheer of admiration. It was the nervous excitement of people watching a powder keg being lit. No one expected a performance. They came to see a battle, a struggle between man and beast. But if anyone had been keeping score, it was clear who was winning. Thunder had thrown off every saddle, shattered every bridle, and made fools of men who had once broken wild mustangs for a living. He was everything nature meant a stallion to be: raw, beautiful, wild, and above all, dangerous. By midday, the heat shimmered off the sand in waves, and the tension in the arena thickened. Children sat on the edge of their seats, clutching popcorn bags frozen midair, while adults murmured about the one no one could touch. Thunder pawed the ground with impatience, sending up puffs of dust as he tossed his head, snorting so loud it made nearby horses rear up in their own pens. His reputation had grown like folklore. Some claimed he had never let a human touch him. Others swore they had seen a glint of intelligence in his eyes, like he knew exactly what people were trying to do to him, and laughed at their failure. The announcer, sensing the audience's rising energy, leaned into the mic with a smirk in his voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we've got here is a heart of steel and hooves that don't take orders. They say thunder bows to no man. But maybe, just maybe, today will be different." The crowd laughed, some skeptically, others with a twinge of hope, but most believed nothing would change. Thunder wasn't a challenge to be overcome. He was a warning carved in muscle and fury. He stood now in the center of the arena, chest heaving, eyes glinting with menace. And yet there was something else, something subtle but unmistakable. It wasn't just rage that radiated from him. It was pain, a kind of haunted resistance that no whip could beat out of him, because it didn't come from fear. It came from loss, from betrayal, from somewhere deep in his spirit that no one had bothered to understand. They had tried to force him, break him, dominate him, but none had tried to reach him. And so, Thunder remained untouchable. Until that day, the tension in the arena was already palpable when a ripple of confusion began to spread through the crowd. It started as a few murmurs in the front rows, a rustle of uncertain whispers as heads turned toward the far side of the field. Something was happening, something no one expected. Out from the side gate, not with a dramatic entrance or any announcement, came a boy, a teenager, rolling forward in a wheelchair, alone, slowly, steadily, without fanfare. At first, no one understood what they were seeing. The crowd had been waiting for a trainer, maybe another brave soul foolish enough to challenge Thunder, but this was something else entirely. His arms pushed steadily against the wheels, moving with quiet determination. No helmet, no whip, just a pale-faced boy, maybe 16 or 17, with a focused expression and a silence about him that made the cheers and laughter in the arena fade to uneasy quiet. His name was Julian Price. The name wouldn't have meant anything to most of the audience, not anymore. But if you'd been around the equestrian circuit just 2 years earlier, you'd know him as the rising star. The boy who rode like he was born in the saddle, who won competitions not with brute strength but with grace, with connection. His style was something that had been whispered about by old ranchers and seasoned riders alike. A gift, they'd called it, a bond with horses that couldn't be taught. He had a future, until the future took a violent turn. 2 years ago, Julian had been a name spoken with admiration. Then came a weekend joyride with friends, a split-second decision to take a dirt path just a little too fast, a single moment of misjudgment. The ATV had flipped before anyone could scream. Julian was thrown hard. The world went black. He woke in a hospital bed with doctors speaking gently but clearly. His spine was broken. From the waist down, there would be no recovery. The boy who once flew on horseback now couldn't walk. Julian had disappeared after that, from competitions, from friends, from life. The once bold, smiling teen became a ghost in his own home, retreating behind closed doors, withdrawing even from the animals he had once adored. His mother, Sarah, had tried everything. Therapists, support groups, equine therapy centers, even just quiet moments in the barn where horses still waited, hoping he'd speak, move, react. But nothing reached him. He had built walls high and thick around himself, unreachable, until today. She had brought him to the Silver Ridge showcase out of desperation, not expectation, not to perform, not even to participate, just to watch, to be near the sound of hooves again, to maybe feel a flicker of something familiar. But she hadn't anticipated this. Not the moment when he suddenly, without a word, rolled away from the sidelines and toward the ring. Not the way his eyes locked onto the Stallion, as if drawn by something deeper than memory. She had seen it, his expression change, the fog lift, something stir. The crowd didn't understand. They saw a boy in a wheelchair heading toward a creature known to be wild and dangerous, and they didn't know whether to laugh, panic, or stare. "What's this kid doing?" someone whispered. "Is this part of the show?" Others weren't as kind. "He can't even walk. Get him out of there before that horse tramples him." The voices rose, but Julian didn't seem to hear them. Or maybe he did, and simply didn't care. He wheeled himself steadily until he was just outside the fence line, where Thunder stood like a living storm. The Stallion snorted, ears twitching, sensing something new in the air. Julian stopped, his hands gripping the wheels tightly, his knuckles pale. His mother hovered behind him, hesitant, one hand on his shoulder, her mouth half open as if to speak, but no words came. She knew that look. She had seen it long ago when he was still walking, still riding, still winning ribbons. It was the look he had before every ride, calm, focused, ready. There were no theatrics, no announcement, just a quiet stillness as the crowd's curiosity began to tilt toward disbelief. Julian didn't move again. He just stared at Thunder, at this enormous, furious creature who had resisted every hand that had tried to control him. Julian's eyes didn't narrow. They didn't show fear. They simply watched with something else, something deeper. Recognition. Thunder paced. His hooves struck the ground with power. His body tensed like a coiled spring, and yet he didn't charge. He didn't rear. He watched Julian back, their gazes locked, man and beast, both wounded, both wild in their own ways, separated by a fence, but not much else. In that electric moment, the crowd went silent. The energy shifted. It wasn't excitement anymore. It was something slower, more reverent. No one knew what was happening, but they knew they were witnessing something unusual, maybe even impossible, because Julian wasn't just a boy in a wheelchair, and Thunder wasn't just a wild stallion. They were something else entirely, and whatever it was, it had just begun. "What's he doing?" The words slipped out in a whisper, but they carried through the tense air like a shout in a cathedral. The crowd was no longer cheering. The laughter had faded. All eyes were locked on the strange, surreal image unfolding before them. A teenage boy in a wheelchair facing off with one of the most feared stallions in the country. A murmur of uncertainty rippled across the stands, confusion turning into concern, concern into disbelief. Parents leaned over to shield their children, as if bracing for chaos. Some people stood up, thinking maybe they were about to witness something dangerous. Others sat frozen, torn between curiosity and alarm. Everyone wanted to know the same thing. What was he doing? Julian didn't flinch. He didn't glance back at the murmuring crowd, or his mother standing stiffly behind him. He just stared ahead, locked in a quiet confrontation with Thunder. It was absurd, almost laughable on the surface. A boy who couldn't walk, who hadn't touched a horse in over 2 years, who'd once been a champion and now lived in silence, daring to approach the most uncontrollable animal anyone there had ever seen. No ropes, no equipment, no plan. Just him and his chair, and a kind of stillness that somehow felt louder than any shout. Thunder let out a sharp snort, tossing his head as if offended by the audacity. His hooves pounded once against the ground, sending a tremor through the sand that vibrated through the stadium seating. But Julian didn't back down. His eyes didn't blink. He didn't flinch at the raw power on display. He just sat there, unmoving, and then he raised one hand, slowly, deliberately, as if reaching for something only he could see. There was a collective intake of breath. Some gasped. Others chuckled awkwardly, convinced the boy had lost his mind. "Is this some kind of stunt?" someone muttered. "He's going to get hurt," another hissed. "Someone stop this." But no one moved. Not the organizers, not the trainers, not even Julian's mother. Because even as fear and doubt crept in, there was something strange in the air now, something none of them could quite define. Thunder hadn't charged. He hadn't backed away either. He was staring, muscles tense, breathing heavy, but he was listening. And then Julian spoke, not loudly, not with drama, but with a calmness that cut through the noise like a blade through water. "I know what it's like to lose control." That was all he said, Just that, and it made no sense to anyone but him. But the moment the words left his mouth, something shifted in Thunder's body. His ears flicked, his front hoof paused mid-paw, and for just a heartbeat, he stood perfectly still. Julian knew exactly what he was doing, even if no one else did. He wasn't trying to tame Thunder. He wasn't trying to impress the crowd or relive some echo of the rider he used to be. He was reaching out, not with force, not with training, but with something far more dangerous and rare: vulnerability. He wasn't there to control the stallion. He was there to connect with him, and somehow, impossibly, the stallion seemed to sense it. The crowd's silence grew heavy, like the air just before a storm breaks. People were no longer mocking or confused. They were watching, truly watching, waiting to see if the impossible was about to happen. Thunder stomped again, but this time not out of rage. It was hesitation, a signal of uncertainty, as if this powerful, untouchable creature was grappling with something foreign: curiosity. Julian didn't move. He didn't speak again. He just kept his hand lifted, steady, offering something invisible, something every person in the arena could feel but not explain. Thunder took a single step forward. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was real. And it wasn't out of aggression. It was interest, maybe even recognition. The wild stallion had heard 1,000 commands. He'd fought 100 trainers, but not one of them had looked at him the way this boy did. Not with dominance, not with fear, but with understanding. And that was why Thunder paused, why he didn't lash out, why he didn't turn away. Because deep down, they weren't so different. One had been broken on the outside, the other on the inside, but both had scars that couldn't be seen. Both had lost something they didn't know how to get back. And now, in the middle of an arena packed with eyes, they had found each other. Not a single person dared to speak. They just watched, frozen, holding their breath, because they could feel it too now. Something was happening, something bigger than horse and rider, bigger than any competition or show. And though no one could explain it yet, they all understood one thing. This wasn't a stunt. This was a moment, and it had only just begun. The arena was still. The kind of still that comes when every breath is being held, when every sound fades into the background because something entirely new is unfolding right in front of you and no one knows what to make of it. Thunder, the wild stallion with fire in his blood and rebellion in his soul, had stopped pacing. His massive frame stood firm but alert, his ears flicking forward, his nostrils wide as he stared directly at the boy in the wheelchair. The crowd didn't know what to expect. Honestly, neither did Julian, but something unspoken was passing between them, something that couldn't be measured in commands or cues. Thunder's hooves didn't stomp in defiance this time. His breathing slowed. His eyes didn't flash with fury. They studied Julian as if trying to understand who or what he was really seeing. Julian didn't move. Every instinct in him told him not to. There was a rhythm to this now, a silent pulse that connected them in a way neither muscle nor strength could ever force. He had learned long ago that sometimes the loudest voice is the quietest one. And right now, he wasn't a boy trying to prove himself. He wasn't even a rider anymore. He was just a soul stripped bare, speaking to another that had never let anyone close. Thunder didn't know about wheelchairs or accidents or trauma, but he knew pain, he knew fear, he knew what it was to have the world try to control him, reshape him, force him into a box that didn't fit. And now, here was someone who understood that without saying a word. The moment stretched. Seconds felt like minutes. A bead of sweat slid down Julian's temple, but he didn't notice. He was focused entirely on the stallion, his heartbeat matching the slow, deliberate breaths that echoed from Thunder's chest. The horse shifted slightly, just enough to cause the dust beneath his hooves to rise in lazy spirals. Then he took another step forward. Not a lunge, not a challenge, a step, a choice. From the stands came a few gasps, quickly stifled. No one wanted to break the spell. Thunder had never stepped toward anyone without aggression. Trainers had to trap him, corral him, sneak up on him. He didn't come to people. But now he was closing the space between him and Julian, not out of fear or pressure, but because he wanted to. Julian didn't smile. He didn't cry. He just let it happen, heart pounding, barely breathing. The power of that moment wasn't in its size. It was in its stillness. Two broken beings, each scarred in ways the world couldn't see, moving toward each other because they recognized something familiar. Not weakness, but strength, born from suffering. Thunder stopped just a few feet away, close enough for Julian to hear the soft exhale of air from his nostrils, to see the flecks of dust on his coat, to feel the raw presence of an animal that had never allowed anyone this close. Still, neither of them moved. Then, in a motion so gradual it felt like time itself had slowed, Thunder lowered his head. Inch by inch, muscle by muscle, the stallion dipped his chin, the corded tension in his neck easing as if releasing something he had held onto for far too long. His knees bent, his massive frame sank lower, and then he knelt, fully, his body resting gently in the sand before Julian, eyes soft, ears tilted not back in warning, but forward in recognition. And the arena exploded, but not with chaos, with something else. Something deeper than clapping or cheering. It was awe. People rose from their seats, hands to their mouths, eyes wide with disbelief. It was the kind of reaction that didn't come from witnessing a show. It came from witnessing something sacred. Some wept, overwhelmed by what they couldn't explain. Others stood in stunned silence, blinking as if they couldn't quite trust what they were seeing. Because in all the years this arena had hosted events, competitions, and showcases, no one had ever seen a moment like this. The untamable beast had bowed, not to a master, not to a trainer, but to a boy in a wheelchair who hadn't lifted a finger. Julian didn't celebrate. He didn't even move. His eyes locked with Thunder's, his body motionless, his soul caught in the gravity of what had just happened. Because he knew this wasn't submission. This wasn't about dominance or control. It wasn't even about trust yet. It was something even more rare. It was the beginning of understanding. His mother watched from the sideline, tears streaming silently down her cheeks, one hand over her mouth. She had brought her son here in hopes that the old world he loved might bring him a moment of light. She had never expected this. What had just taken place between her son and that stallion defied everything she had ever believed about grief, about healing, about horses. Because it wasn't just the horse who knelt. It was her son rising. Not out of his chair, but out of the darkness that had consumed him for 2 years. Rising into something he hadn't felt in so long, he'd almost forgotten the name for it. Hope. Thunder remained there, still kneeling, as if waiting, as if offering something back, and Julian, for the first time in a very long time, felt whole. not because the pain was gone, not because his legs worked again, but because someone, something, had seen him. Not the wheelchair, not the accident, but him. And for a boy who had felt invisible for far too long, that was everything. There were moments in life that unfolded with such quiet power, they left a permanent imprint, not just on the people who witnessed them, but on the very space where they occurred. And this was one of those moments. Thunder, the wild stallion who had defied ropes, bucked off seasoned trainers, and resisted every attempt to bring him under control, remained kneeling in the dirt before a teenage boy in a wheelchair. It wasn't a performance. It wasn't a trick. There had been no commands, no pressure, no showmanship, just presence, just understanding, just stillness. The crowd, which moments ago had been roaring with disbelief, now fell into a strange, respectful hush. It wasn't silence out of confusion, it was reverence. The kind of reverence people felt when they witnessed something so deeply human, yet so completely beyond explanation that all they could do was hold their breath and let it sink into them. People didn't dare speak. They didn't even shift in their seats. Children clutched their parents' arms without knowing why. Adults blinked slowly, trying to process the weight of what they were seeing. Because it wasn't just that Thunder had bowed, it was the reason why. And it was everything. Julian's body hadn't moved an inch since the stallion began his descent. But inside, something was happening. A floodgate had cracked open. Something long buried under trauma and silence and bitterness began to push its way up through the rubble of who he had become. He could feel it in his chest, swelling quietly, not a loud explosion, but a slow, warm surge of something he barely recognized. Peace, maybe even pride. He had never asked for this, never thought himself capable of reaching anyone or anything again. He'd gone numb after the accident, after the hospital stays, after the constant reminder that the life he once knew was gone. And yet, somehow, without a saddle, without even standing on 2 feet, he had reached one of the most untouchable creatures anyone had ever known. And not through strength, through stillness, through empathy, through showing up as he was, broken body and all, and offering no threat, just understanding. Thunder's breathing had calmed. His body was no longer rigid with tension. His head remained low, eyes no longer fierce and wild, but soft, studying. It was as if the stallion had seen into Julian, not the chair, not the injury, but the boy who used to soar through open pastures on horseback, who used to feel invincible. And in that connection, the horse had found something familiar. Maybe Thunder had once known freedom like that too, before the fences, before the pens, before the attempts to break him. Maybe he saw in Julian what he had felt in himself, a longing for what had been lost, and the deep, quiet pain of no longer knowing where he belonged. What happened in that arena wasn't about one boy or one horse. It was about the invisible thread that connects beings who have known pain, who have been hurt, who have been misunderstood. It was about recognition, not in the physical, but in the spirit. And the connection that sparked in that recognition couldn't be forced. It couldn't be taught. It had to be earned by showing the truth of who you are, scars and all. And Julian, whether he knew it or not, had done exactly that. There was no movement, no applause, no command to break the moment. It just existed, perfect and unrepeatable. When the crowd finally began to breathe again, it was as though they were coming back from somewhere far away. Some clapped quietly, unsure if it was the right response. Others simply watched, eyes still wide, holding hands over their hearts or shaking their heads in disbelief, but none of them would ever forget what they saw, because it wasn't about the kneeling, it was about the surrender, not of power, but of fear. Julian let out a slow breath, eyes never leaving Thunder's. He didn't need to say anything. Everything that needed to be said had already been spoken in the silence. There was no need to declare victory. This wasn't a battle won. It was something more sacred, a door opening, a wall falling, and the beginning of something neither of them could have expected. Eventually, Thunder rose, not with panic, not with force. He moved slowly, gracefully, standing tall again, but he didn't back away. He didn't retreat. He remained close, head still lowered just slightly, as if to say, "I'm still here. I'm not afraid." Julian didn't reach out. He didn't try to pet him or force a touch. He simply allowed the space between them to hold everything that had just occurred. And Thunder respected that space. It was theirs now, shared, silent, sacred. For everyone else in the stands, it had been a show unlike anything they'd seen. For Julian, it was something else entirely. It was proof that he wasn't lost, that he hadn't disappeared into his injury, into the shadows of what used to be. Somewhere, deep down, the part of him that used to believe, used to trust, was still alive. Fragile, maybe, but still there. And it had answered when Thunder called. As Julian's mother stepped gently toward him, placing a hand on his shoulder with trembling fingers, she didn't speak. She didn't have to. Her eyes said everything. In the Stallion's bow, she had seen her son rise. Not physically, but emotionally, spiritually. He had found something no doctor could prescribe, no therapy session could replicate. He had found himself, even if just for a moment, and that moment was enough to change everything. The crowd would later call it a miracle. Trainers would analyze it, skeptics would debate it, and journalists would try to put it into words. But for Julian and Thunder, it was something no one else could label. It was theirs, a bond forged not through mastery or training, but through the deepest language of all, mutual pain, and the courage to trust again. That moment didn't just change the way people saw Thunder, it changed the way they saw Julian, and maybe, just maybe, it began to change the way Julian saw himself. Long before the arena, long before the wheelchair, long before a wild stallion named Thunder ever crossed his path, Julian Price was known for something else. He was the boy who flew. That's what people used to say. At county fairs, at riding competitions, at early morning practice sessions when the world was still quiet and the horses hadn't yet woken up fully, they'd watch him and whisper with wonder. There was something about the way Julian moved in the saddle, fluid, effortless, like he and the horse weren't two beings, but one. He didn't ride with brute strength or showy technique. He didn't need to. He connected, deeply, instinctively, as if he could hear the thoughts of the horse beneath him and respond with nothing more than a shift of weight or a breath. Judges called it talent. Coaches called it rare. But those who really knew horses knew the truth. It wasn't something that could be trained. It was a gift. Julian had started riding at 5. By 7, he was winning small-town ribbons. By 10, he was drawing attention from bigger stables. By 15, he had a wall full of awards and more than a few competitors watching his every move. But it wasn't the accolades that drove him. It was the feeling, the wind in his face, the thundering of hooves beneath him, the unity with something so powerful and alive. On horseback, Julian felt free, completely and utterly unchained. There were no limits, no ceilings. He wasn't just riding, he was flying, and to a boy with dreams as wide as the sky, it felt like nothing could touch him. Until the accident. It happened on a Saturday. He had begged his mom to let him take the ATV out with a few friends, just for a couple of hours, just around the hills outside town. She had hesitated. He remembered the way she looked at him that morning, keys in hand, worry in her eyes. But he'd smiled the way he always did when he wanted something. Confident, charming, unstoppable. She gave in. Of course she did. What mother could imagine what would come next? They'd raced through the trails, kicking up dust, laughing, shouting over the roar of engines. Julian led the pack, as always, daring and reckless. He took a sharp bend at high speed, a bend he had taken a dozen times before. But this time, something was different. The ground was loose. The tire caught a hidden rut, and in a second too fast to react, the world turned upside down. The ATV flipped. Julian was thrown like a rag doll. His spine cracked before he hit the ground. His head never touched the dirt, but the damage had already been done. When he woke in the hospital, the lights were too bright. The voices were too soft. He couldn't feel his legs. He tried to move them, panicked when nothing happened. Doctors came in, nurses, his mother. Everyone spoke gently. Everyone looked at him like he was fragile glass. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just stared at the ceiling and let it sink in, like cement filling his lungs. His body had survived. But everything else, everything he had been, it was gone. The world moved on without him. Competitions came and went. His horses were sold or transferred to other riders. His friends tried to visit at first, awkward and too cheerful, but eventually the visits stopped. He didn't blame them. What do you say to someone who lost everything that made them who they were? Julian had always been strong, always bold, but that strength shattered in silence. He stopped speaking about horses, stopped watching competitions, stopped looking in mirrors. The boy who had once commanded entire arenas now couldn't bring himself to leave his bedroom, and when he did, it was only because his mother pushed, gently, constantly, never giving up, even when he wished she would. She suggested therapy. He ignored it. She showed him videos of adaptive riders, para-equestrians, success stories of people in chairs doing the impossible. He shut the laptop. She took him to therapy centers. He went through the motions, offered polite nods, answered questions with shrugs. None of it touched him, because none of it could give him back what he had lost. Julian didn't miss the attention or the awards. He missed feeling alive. He missed that moment when he and a horse would breathe together as one, when he could outrun everything, his fears, his doubts, even time itself, and no chair, no speech, no platitude could bring that back. So he buried it, all of it. He stopped speaking about the accident, refused to look at the saddle that still sat, dusty and untouched, in the corner of the garage. He didn't go near the barn anymore. When his mother mentioned horses, he changed the subject. When she pushed harder, he shut down. Eventually, she stopped asking, but she never stopped hoping. And when the Silver Ridge Equestrian Showcase came to town, she didn't ask him if he wanted to go. She told him he was coming, not to participate, just to watch, just to be near it again, just to remember. Julian didn't want to go, but something in her voice, gentle but firm, filled with that unwavering mother's love, made him say yes. He convinced himself he would sit through it, feel nothing, leave early. He didn't expect to see thunder, didn't expect to feel that stir in his chest the moment the stallion burst into view, raging and majestic and utterly unbroken. He didn't expect the shaking in his hands, the ache in his chest, the strange and terrifying hope that began to rise. But most of all, he didn't expect what would come next, because nothing in his long fall from grace had prepared him for what that horse would awaken inside him. The crowd might have seen a miracle when thunder bowed, but for Julian it was something else. It was a memory of who he used to be, and the terrifying question of who he might still become. He hadn't just seen a wild stallion in that arena. He'd seen a mirror, and for the first time in 2 years, Julian Price saw a reflection worth reaching for. The days that followed the showcase were unlike anything Julian had experienced since the accident. It wasn't just the moment in the arena that lingered, it was everything that came after. The quiet stares from strangers who now looked at him with a mix of awe and confusion. The hushed conversations he overheard at the diner, where someone would whisper, "That's the kid who got thunder to kneel." And the way his mother seemed to smile a little differently now, prouder, yes, but with something deeper behind her eyes, a kind of cautious hope that hadn't been there in years. But for Julian, it wasn't about what anyone else thought. It wasn't about being noticed. It wasn't even about the spectacle. It was about what that one silent moment with thunder had stirred awake inside him, something he didn't fully understand, something he wasn't sure he was ready to face. He kept going back to the stable, quietly, alone. He didn't announce himself or ask anyone's permission. He would just show up, wheel himself to the edge of the corral, and sit there for hours, saying nothing. Sometimes thunder would ignore him completely, pacing restlessly in the enclosure, as if testing the boundaries of his cage. Other times the stallion would stop mid-step, glance in Julian's direction, and simply watch. They never interacted the way people expected. There were no dramatic reunions, no sudden displays of affection. It was subtle, barely noticeable to the average eye, but Julian could feel it, a shift, a slow dismantling of a wall that neither of them had realized they'd built. What surprised Julian most wasn't how thunder responded to him. It was how he responded to thunder. There was no fear, no pressure to perform, no need to prove anything. For the first time since the accident, Julian wasn't thinking about what he couldn't do. He wasn't measuring himself against the person he used to be. He was just there, present, listening, waiting, and that was enough, because in Thunder's presence there was no judgment, no pity, just a raw, unspoken honesty between two beings who had both been forced to fight battles no one else could see. He started talking to Thunder, not like a trainer to a horse, but like one soul to another. Some days he would sit quietly, just murmuring thoughts into the open air. Other days he spoke more clearly, told stories, shared memories, spoke about his fear, his anger, the bitterness he'd swallowed every day since waking up in that hospital bed. He didn't know if Thunder understood the words, but he understood the tone, the feeling, the weight behind them. And somehow that was enough. Thunder would stand nearby, close but never too close, occasionally flicking his ears in Julian's direction, as if acknowledging the pain without intruding on it. Hank, The grizzled old trainer who had been working with Thunder for months started noticing the difference. He'd seen that horse at his worst, knew how dangerous he could be. But now, Thunder wasn't the same. He was still fierce, still unpredictable, but something in his demeanor had shifted. He didn't lash out as quickly. He didn't rear when approached. And every time Julian was nearby, the stallion seemed calmer, more grounded, less like a storm and more like the quiet that follows it. Hank didn't say much at first. He wasn't the kind of man to throw praise around. But one afternoon, after watching Julian and Thunder sit in silence for nearly an hour, he finally walked over and said, "Whatever you're doing, kid, don't stop." Julian nodded, unsure what to say. He didn't feel like he was doing anything. He was just existing, sharing space with something wild and hurting and real. But in that stillness, something was changing, not just in Thunder but in Julian too. He started sleeping better, started eating with a little more appetite, started responding when his mother asked him questions, not with one-word answers, but with something that resembled conversation. He didn't feel like he was healing, not in the way people usually described it. He still had dark days, still had moments where the weight of the past felt unbearable. But now there was something else too, a tiny flicker of direction, of possibility. People began to notice the bond. Volunteers, staff, even strangers who came to the stable just to catch a glimpse of the infamous wild horse that had bowed to a boy in a wheelchair. Some of them tried to recreate the moment. They approached Thunder with sugar cubes, soft voices, slow movements. But it never worked. The stallion would rear or bolt or turn his back entirely. He wasn't interested in attention. He wasn't interested in tricks. He responded only to Julian, and no one knew why. Some said it was a miracle, others said it was luck, but Julian knew better. Thunder didn't trust easily. He didn't give himself away. What they shared couldn't be duplicated because it wasn't born of control. It was born of pain, and the quiet decision to keep showing up in spite of it. One afternoon, Julian sat at the edge of the corral with his arms resting on the wheels of his chair, eyes half closed, sun warming his skin. Thunder was nearby, grazing lazily, his ears twitching in rhythm with the wind. Without even thinking, Julian said, "You know, I used to feel like I was invincible." His voice was soft, not meant for anyone in particular. "I thought nothing could touch me. Then everything did, all at once." He paused. Thunder's tail flicked. "I don't think I'll ever be that kid again, but maybe I'm supposed to be something else now. Maybe we both are." Thunder didn't react, not in the way people expect animals to. But he lifted his head, turned slightly, and walked a few steps closer, close enough that Julian could see the reflection of himself in the horse's dark eyes. Not the broken version, not the one everyone pitied, but the one who kept coming back, the one who didn't run from the hard parts, the one who, despite everything, was still trying. And in that silent exchange, something unspoken passed between them. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't even hope. It was simpler than that. It was the acknowledgement that healing doesn't come in grand declarations or sudden victories. It comes in showing up, day after day, in the quiet, in the dust, in the presence of someone or something that sees you for who you really are and stays anyway. The first signs were subtle. A few side glances at the local diner, a couple of posts online that seemed more questioning than celebratory. At first, Julian ignored them. After all, the moment with Thunder had been pure, honest. He hadn't gone to the arena to make a statement, to perform, or to impress anyone. He had been drawn there by something he couldn't explain and acted on a feeling no one else could understand. But once the videos began spreading, first from spectators who had captured the stallion bowing, then from social media accounts eager to go viral, the quiet miracle began to twist under the weight of public attention. What had started as wonder quickly turned to doubt. And what had been celebrated by those who were there began to be questioned by those who hadn't seen it for themselves. It started with a few comments. "This can't be real. That horse must have been trained to do that. Probably some trick for attention." Then came the louder voices, equestrian purists, experienced trainers, professionals who had heard about Thunder long before Julian ever arrived on the scene. They questioned how a teenager in a wheelchair, with no reins, no tools, and no formal authority, could have succeeded where seasoned experts had failed. They called it irresponsible, dangerous, said it set a bad example. One trainer even posted a long critique online claiming the kneeling was likely the result of a stress response, not trust, and accused Julian, without naming him directly, of exploiting the horse for sympathy. The comment section lit up. Some defended Julian, others joined in the criticism, but no matter how loud the supporters were, it was the negativity that stuck. Julian tried not to read the posts, but curiosity always won. He scrolled late into the night, rereading the same lines, dissecting every sentence, wondering if they were right. Had Thunder kneeled out of fear? Had he misunderstood the moment entirely? Was he fooling himself? He stopped going to the stable for a couple of days. Not because he no longer wanted to be near Thunder, but because the shame had started to creep in. The doubt wrapped around his spine like vines, tightening every time he remembered the words reckless, unqualified, fake. He didn't want to be the center of some debate. He just wanted to be seen, for once, not as a mistake, not as broken, but as someone still capable of connection. His mother noticed immediately. She didn't say anything the first day, or the second, but on the third morning she found him sitting in the garage, staring at the old saddle they'd never gotten around to storing. He looked smaller than he had in weeks, like all the weight he'd managed to lift off his shoulders had come crashing back down. She knelt beside him, gently placing a hand on his knee. "They don't know what they're talking about," she said softly. "They didn't see what I saw." But Julian didn't answer, because the truth was, he wasn't sure what he saw anymore either. When he finally returned to the stable, Hank was waiting. The old trainer leaned against the fence, arms crossed, eyes thoughtful, not judgmental, not condescending, just watching. As Julian wheeled up, he didn't even pretend to smile. His shoulders sagged, his hands clenched around the wheels, his energy muted. "They're saying it was a fluke," he said, barely loud enough to be heard. "They're saying I didn't do anything, that Thunder's just trained to act like that I'm some sideshow." Hank didn't speak right away. He just let the words hang there, heavy and sharp. Then he stepped forward, crouching down so he was level with Julian. "I've worked with horses my whole life," he said. "I've seen riders win blue ribbons with hearts full of ego and hands full of fear. And I've seen people with no trophies and no spotlight walk into a stable and change an animal's life because they led with honesty instead of control." He paused, eyes locking onto Julian's. What you did out there wasn't training, it wasn't trickery, it was connection. And connection doesn't need to be proven to anyone." Still, the words clung to Julian's ribs. He wanted to believe Hank, wanted to believe his mother. But the noise was loud, and doubt, once it finds a crack, knows how to spread. He watched Thunder grazing nearby, calm as ever, completely unaware of the firestorm swirling outside the fences. For a long moment, Julian just sat there, letting the quiet fill the spaces where his confidence used to live. "But what if they're right?" he asked. "What if it was just a moment, just luck?" "Then it was the kind of luck most people spend a lifetime chasing," Hank said. "But I don't think it was, and neither does he." He nodded toward Thunder. The stallion had lifted his head, ears pricked, gaze fixed on Julian. Not wild, not wary, just present, just there. In the days that followed, Julian kept showing up. He didn't engage with the criticism anymore. He didn't post. He didn't respond. He just went back to what mattered, being near Thunder, talking, listening, letting the noise fall away until only the quiet remained. And in that space, he began to realize something the critics would never understand, because they hadn't knelt in the dirt. They hadn't looked into the eyes of a creature who had every reason to hate, to resist, to run, and seen trust staring back. They hadn't felt what it meant to be accepted by something that didn't owe them anything. Julian didn't need to convince the world. He didn't need to justify the moment. All he needed to do was protect it, nurture it, let it grow in the quiet, away from the shouting and the spectacle. Because what he and Thunder had wasn't for show. It was for healing. And healing, real healing, never needed an audience. He returned to the stable the next morning just after sunrise. The sky was pale with early light. Thunder stood at the far end of the corral, but the moment Julian wheeled through the gate, the horse turned and walked toward him. Not fast, not urgent, but with steady, purposeful steps. Julian's throat tightened. The doubt tried to surface again, but he let it pass. He didn't need to force anything, didn't need a repeat of the kneeling or another viral moment. All he needed was this quiet, steady walk, this presence, this partnership that didn't ask for explanation. Because when everything else had fallen apart, this bond had begun to piece him back together, not with noise, but with trust. And for Julian, that was more than enough. It started with a simple invitation, an offer delivered in a white envelope that Julian found sitting on the kitchen table one morning, his name written in elegant script across the front. He stared at it for a long time before opening it, his fingers hesitant, uncertain. Inside was an official letter from the organizers of the Silver Ridge Equestrian Showcase. They wanted him back, not to spectate, not to sit quietly in the background. They wanted him and Thunder to return to the arena. Together. No pressure, no requirement to perform. Just an opportunity, an open space, a second chance. Julian's first instinct was to say no. The moment he had shared with Thunder in the arena had been pure, and in its purity it had felt untouchable. Going back felt dangerous, not physically, but emotionally. What if it didn't happen again? What if Thunder didn't respond the same way? What if the crowd returned with their phones out and their doubts sharp and waiting, ready to dismantle whatever piece they had built? He didn't want to be a spectacle. He didn't want to try to recreate something that had never been about performance in the first place. But his mother saw the hesitation in his eyes and gently reminded him that this wasn't about the critics, this wasn't about the crowd, it wasn't even about the horse, it was about him. It was about stepping into the very place where his life had shifted and seeing if the healing could continue, not through approval or applause, but through presence, through facing it. So he said yes, quietly, without fanfare. He didn't tell anyone, didn't announce it. He just circled the date in red on the calendar and went back to the stable like he always did, day after day, sitting beside Thunder, speaking in low tones, letting the bond between them grow deeper and more certain. They didn't practice tricks, they didn't rehearse. There was nothing choreographed or calculated about the way they prepared. Julian would sit for hours talking about his life, his fears, his dreams that still lingered like embers despite everything. Thunder would stand near him, listening in his own silent way, sometimes brushing the air with his muzzle as if responding, sometimes simply resting in the same space, offering the kind of companionship that needed no words. The day of the showcase came with a sharp morning chill, the kind that clung to the lungs and made every breath feel fresh, new. Julian sat in the holding area, his hands resting on his wheels, eyes locked on the arena gate just ahead. Thunder stood beside him, calm, unhurried, his coat gleaming under the early sunlight. The announcer's voice rang out over the loudspeakers, echoing across the packed stands, calling his name with a mix of respect and reverence. "Julian Price," the voice said, "the young man who showed us all what connection looks like." As they moved toward the entrance, Julian didn't feel fear. He felt still, not empty but grounded. It wasn't like the last time when everything had happened so suddenly. This time, he was choosing it. This time, he was walking, rolling, into the moment with intention, not accident. And that changed everything. They entered the ring together, Julian in his chair, Thunder beside him, untethered, unrestrained, completely free to turn away if he chose to. The crowd didn't cheer right away. They didn't know how to. This wasn't a performance with music or costumes or flashy cues. This was something quieter, more reverent. The sound that filled the arena was the sound of breath. Thousands of people inhaling at once, watching, waiting, unsure of what they were about to witness. Julian stopped near the center of the ring. Thunder paused next to him. For a long moment, they did nothing, just stood together in the open space, under the weight of the sky, surrounded by silence and 1,000 sets of eyes. Julian could feel the tension in the air, the questions, the expectations, but he didn't let it touch him. He wasn't there to prove anything. He was there because he needed to be. Then he spoke. "Thunder," he said quietly, his voice steady. "We don't have to do anything today. You don't owe me anything. I just want to be here with you." The words were soft, but the effect was seismic. Thunder's ears flicked, his head turned. He took a slow step forward, then another. The stallion circled Julian with deliberate movements, his hooves pressing into the sand with the same rhythm they had shared every afternoon in the corral. He wasn't wild, he wasn't broken, he was just present, and that was the miracle. Not that the horse had been tamed, but that he had chosen to stay, to engage, to trust. Julian didn't move, didn't guide. He simply sat with his hands in his lap, eyes following the stallion's path. Thunder came to a stop in front of him, towering yet unthreatening, and lowered his head once again. not as low as before, not with a dramatic kneel, but with a kind of gentle nod, as if to say, "I see you, I remember." And in that subtle gesture, everything that needed to be said was said. The crowd remained silent for a beat longer before applause began to ripple through the arena. Not explosive, not showy, just real, just respectful. Julian didn't wave or smile or acknowledge the noise. He simply leaned forward slightly and whispered, "Thank you." Thunder stayed beside him. In the hours that followed, as reporters tried to turn the moment into headlines and spectators tried to explain what they had seen, Julian slipped quietly out of the arena, away from the lights and the voices. He didn't need their interpretation. He had his own. He hadn't gone back for closure or attention or redemption. He had gone back to see if the moment had been real, if the bond they'd formed had strength beyond circumstance. And it did. He hadn't asked Thunder to kneel. He hadn't needed him to. What mattered wasn't what the horse did. It was that he stayed, that he chose Julian again, in front of the world, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. And for a boy who had lost so much, that quiet loyalty meant everything. Later, back at the stable, Julian brushed his fingers through Thunder's mane, listening to the soft snorts of the stallion settling into his space. "You didn't have to come with me," he whispered, "but you did." Thunder didn't react. He didn't need to. Julian already understood. This was their story, and it was far from over. The performance might have ended, but the ripple of what had happened between Julian and Thunder had only just begun. Words spread like wildfire, not just around Silver Ridge, but across the region, the country, and soon, the internet. Clips of Julian rolling into the arena, Thunder following close behind without bridle or rein, began appearing everywhere. People watched, stunned, as the massive, untamable stallion moved with quiet obedience beside the teenager in a wheelchair. And while many were in awe, struck by the beauty of the unspoken connection they had witnessed, the most powerful effect of all was something neither Julian nor Thunder could have anticipated. The way their story made people feel something they hadn't felt in a long time. Belief. Not in miracles, not in spectacle, but in something much more rare. Authenticity. Yet for Julian, the attention didn't matter. The videos, the headlines, the social media buzz, it was all noise compared to the quiet thunder of hooves beside him, the calm breath of the stallion he now considered a part of himself. He hadn't stepped into the arena to become a symbol or a story. He'd done it because he needed to know the connection they had was real, even with the eyes of the world watching. And it was. More real than anything else he had ever known. Thunder hadn't acted that day. He hadn't performed. He had chosen, just as Julian had chosen to show up. And that mutual choice had rewritten the rules of what people thought was possible. The next few days brought a whirlwind of messages, invitations, and media requests. Television producers wanted interviews. Equine magazines asked for quotes. Organizations offered sponsorships. It was overwhelming, almost suffocating. And at first, Julian pulled back, unsure how to navigate a world that now wanted something from him. But amid all the chaos, one invitation stood out, a small, handwritten letter from a non-profit organization that worked with children who had physical and emotional disabilities. They had seen the video, and more than that, they had felt it. They asked Julian if he would consider bringing Thunder to their equine therapy center, not for publicity, not for a show, but simply to be there, to share whatever it was that he and the Stallion had with children who needed it most. Julian sat with the letter in his lap for a long time. He read it once, then twice. He thought of the children, of the ones like him, who had once been told that their life would be different now, smaller, more limited. He thought of the long, empty days he had spent after his accident, convinced that nothing could reach him, nothing could touch the brokenness inside. And then he thought of Thunder, how the horse had met him in that place of silence, without fear or pity, and helped pull him out, not with force, but with presence. Maybe now they could offer the same to others. The drive to the therapy center was quiet, the countryside passing in a blur of green fields and distant barns. Thunder rode calmly in the trailer, as if he understood this wasn't about training or performance, it was about giving something back. When they arrived, the atmosphere was different than anything Julian had felt at a competition. There were no spotlights, no crowds, no applause, just kids, some in wheelchairs, some walking with braces or assistants, some sitting quietly on benches with wide, curious eyes. And when Thunder stepped out of the trailer, they didn't gasp or cheer. They just watched, slowly, cautiously, like they weren't sure if he was real. Julian wheeled himself forward, speaking softly to Thunder, who stayed close, relaxed, alert, but calm. A small group of children had gathered near the fence, and one of the therapists introduced them one by one. There was Sophie, who was nonverbal but expressive with her eyes and gestures. There was Eli, whose accident mirrored Julian's in heartbreaking detail. And there was Mia, a shy girl who hadn't spoken a full sentence since her diagnosis 2 years ago. Julian didn't try to teach or perform. He just sat beside Thunder and invited the children to come as they were. Some reached out with trembling fingers, some simply sat near the horse, watching his chest rise and fall, absorbing the calm that seemed to radiate from his body. The effect was immediate, and it was profound. Sophie, who rarely reacted to new stimuli, reached up and touched Thunder's mane, then leaned her cheek against his neck. Eli asked if he could lead him in a circle, just once, and when Thunder followed his hesitant steps with quiet obedience, the boy's smile stretched so wide Julian felt something crack open in his chest. And Mia, without prompting, without warning, whispered, "He's beautiful," to no one in particular. Her mother cried silently behind her. By the end of the day, Thunder had become more than a horse. He had become a bridge between silence and sound, between fear and trust, between trauma and healing. And Julian, still unsure if he was strong enough, still doubting if he deserved any of this, realized that maybe the thing he had once thought was his greatest loss had somehow become his greatest gift. They continued returning to the center, week after week, not for fanfare or attention, but because it felt right. Thunder never resisted. He never grew agitated. Around the children, his wildness softened, not lost, just transformed. He was still the Stallion who had once defied every trainer, but now his power lay not in resisting, but in accepting, in choosing to stay, to listen, to let people in. Julian still had bad days. There were still moments when the weight of what he had lost pressed down on him with cruel precision, but those moments no longer defined him. Now, when they came, he remembered the way Thunder looked at him the first time they met, not as someone broken, but as someone real, as someone worth trusting. And slowly, Julian began to believe it too. What they had built was never meant to be a performance. It was never about bending a wild creature to his will. It was about meeting that wildness with his own pain and discovering in that meeting the truth about healing. That it doesn't always come in straight lines, that it's messy, non-linear, full of setbacks and surprises, but that it is possible, and more than that, it's worth it. In the end, Julian and Thunder weren't just a boy and a horse. They were a reminder that sometimes the things that break us also make space for something entirely new. That connection doesn't come from dominance or control, but from stillness, from honesty, from presence, and that even the wildest spirit, when met with gentleness instead of fear, can choose trust over flight. The story that had begun in silence, in pain, in shadow, had grown into something luminous. And as Julian sat beside Thunder on a warm spring afternoon, watching a group of children laugh as they took turns brushing his mane, he finally understood. He hadn't lost everything. He had just started over.